I remember the exact moment. My whole world turned upside down. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a small plastic chair inside a government office, waiting for my number to be called. I had driven 3 hours that morning, all the way from our little town to the city, just to sort out some paperwork for the small pension fund I had been contributing to for 31 years. 31 years, that's how long I worked at the textile factory. 31 years of early mornings, dusty machines, tired hands, and a back that hasn't been the same since 2009. My name is Gerald M. Wangi. I am 63 years old, and up until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought the hardest days of my life were already behind me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I almost ignored it. You know how it is when you're waiting in a government office. You don't want to lose your spot. You don't want to miss your number. But something made me look. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was God. I don't know. All I know is that when I saw the name on the screen, Dr. Amara, St. Luke's Hospital, my stomach dropped before I even answered. Mr. Mwangi. The voice on the other end said, calm, professional, but with something underneath it, something careful. Yes, I said, this is Gerald. Mr. Mwangi, this is Dr. Amara calling from St. Luke's Hospital. We have your wife, Margaret, here with us. She was brought in about 40 minutes ago by ambulance. Sir, she collapsed at home. We need you to come in as soon as possible. I stood up so fast my chair scraped across the floor, and 3 people turned to look at me. Collapsed? What do you mean collapsed? Is she okay? Is Margaret okay? There was a pause, just a small one. But I have replayed that pause 1,000 times since then, because in that pause, I already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. She's alive, Mr. Mwangi, but she's in critical condition. We've moved her to the ICU. Please come as quickly as you can. I don't remember walking out of that office. I don't remember finding my car. I only remember sitting behind the steering wheel, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, and thinking, Margaret. My Margaret? Please, God, please, let me tell you about my wife, because she deserves to be known. Margaret and I met 40 years ago when I was 23 and she was 21. She was selling tomatoes at the market on Saturday mornings, and I used to walk past just to hear her laugh. She had the loudest, most honest laugh I had ever heard. She didn't care who was looking. She just laughed, head back, eyes closed, like joy was something she had more than enough of and didn't mind sharing. I married her 2 years later with almost nothing to my name. I had a bicycle, a small room I was renting, and a job I had just started at the factory. Her family wasn't happy. Her father told her she was making a mistake. But Margaret looked at me and said, Gerald, I don't need much. I just need someone who will still be standing beside me when things get hard. She has never let me forget those words, and neither have I. We built everything together. The small house we own outright, every brick of it was paid for with my factory salary, and Margaret's income from tailoring clothes for the women in our neighborhood. We scrimped and saved for 15 years to put our son, Daniel, through a good school, then through university. We went without new clothes, without holidays, without luxuries, because we truly believed, that investing in our children was the greatest thing we could do. Daniel is 34 now. He's an accountant, good job, nice car, lives in a big house in the city with his wife, Priscilla. Priscilla, I want to be careful about how I talk about her, because I don't want to be unfair. When Daniel first brought her home 6 years ago, I liked her. She was smart and well-dressed, and she shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye. Margaret made her a full meal, and Priscilla said, Mama, this is delicious. And I thought, yes, this is good. Our son has found himself a good woman, but people show you who they are over time, and over time, Priscilla showed us. It started small, little things. She stopped calling Margaret Mama, and started just not calling her anything at all. She would visit less and less. When they did visit, she would sit on our old sofa with her phone in her hand, and a look on her face like she was counting the minutes until she could leave. She made comments as small ones, always deniable about how things were done in our house. Our food was too heavy. The neighborhood was too noisy. The furniture was outdated. Daniel said nothing. That was the part that hurt the most. My son, the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, the boy I used to read to at night until he fell asleep. He would sit right there and hear his wife make those comments and say absolutely nothing. I said nothing too. I am an old man. I have learned that some battles are not worth fighting. I would just look at Margaret, and she would look at me, and we would both look away and continue as if nothing had happened. But something was happening. Something had been happening for a long time. About 2 years ago, Daniel came to me with a proposal. He sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I helped him with his homework as a boy, and he explained that he wanted to expand his accounting practice, start his own firm, but he needed capital, starting money, Dad. He said, I've worked everything out. I just need about $40,000 to get the office started. Equipment, registration, the first 3 months of rent. After that, it runs itself. I looked at him. I looked at his confident eyes, his pressed shirt, his new watch. Daniel, I said, where am I going to find $40,000? Dad, you have the savings account, yours and Mama's. I know you've been saving for years. I've seen the statements. He had seen the statements. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My son had been looking at our bank statements. I didn't ask him how. I didn't raise my voice. I just felt something shift quietly inside my chest, like a door closing very softly in an empty house. Margaret was in the kitchen. She came to the doorway when she heard what we were talking about. She looked at me with those eyes of hers, the ones that always know more than they say, and I saw her shake her head. Just barely, just enough for me to see, but Daniel was our son, and I told myself, this is what parents do. You invest in your children, you believe in them, you help them. I gave him $30,000. Not 40, I kept 10 aside because Margaret insisted, and thank God she did. I transferred it from our joint savings account, and I also added Daniel's name to that account, so he could manage transfers easily while setting up the business. I also gave him access to the secondary account we used for household expenses and emergency funds. He promised he would pay it back within 2 years. That was 2 years ago. Not a single shilling had been returned. And every time Margaret or I brought it up, Daniel would get tense, Priscilla would get cold, the visits would become even shorter, the phone calls even more infrequent, until 3 months ago when the visits stopped altogether. Part 4. 3 hours on the road alone. I drove those 3 hours back to the city in a fog. I called Daniel from the road. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. Daniel, your mother is in the ICU at St. Luke's. I am on my way. Please go there now. I watched the read receipt appear. He had read it. No reply came. I drove faster. When I arrived at St. Luke's, I ran, and I want you to understand, a 63-year-old man with a bad back does not run easily. I ran to the reception desk and gave them Margaret's name. They took me to the ICU waiting area and told me Dr. Amara would come speak to me shortly. I stood there in that corridor for a moment, breathing hard, heart hammering, and then I looked to my left. And I saw them, Daniel and Priscilla, sitting in 2 chairs against the wall. Daniel was scrolling on his phone. Priscilla had a paper cup of coffee and was looking at the ceiling. They were so calm, so completely, utterly calm. I stood there and stared at them for a long moment. My son looked up and saw me. He stood. Dad, you made it. I made it. Like I had arrived at a dinner party. Daniel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, how long have you been here? He looked at Priscilla briefly. About 2 hours. 2 hours. They had been here for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours, not one of them had called me. Not one of them had thought to pick up the phone and say, "Dad, come quickly. Mama is here and it's serious." The hospital had called me. A doctor I had never met, my own son, had not called me. I felt something move through me in that moment. Something I had no name for then. Looking back now, I think it was the last thing breaking inside me. The last thread of a very old illusion finally giving way. "Where is the doctor?" I asked. "He said he'll come out soon. They're still running tests." Daniel paused. "She was already here when we arrived, Dad. They found her on the floor of the kitchen. They found her like she was a lost object, like she was furniture. Who found her? The neighbor, Mrs. Aching. She said she came to borrow something and the door was open and she heard a sound. Mrs. Aching, not Daniel, not Priscilla, a neighbor." I sat down in a chair on the opposite side of the corridor from them, and I folded my hands and I stared at the floor, and I did what I have always done when something tears me open. I stayed quiet. Dr. Amaro was a young man, younger than Daniel, it seemed, with kind eyes and very direct speech. "Mr. Mwangi," he said, sitting across from me in a small consultation room, "your wife suffered a hypertensive crisis. Her blood pressure reached a dangerously high level. We believe it was triggered by severe emotional stress, combined with the fact that she has not been taking her medication consistently." I blinked. Medication? What medication? Margaret takes blood pressure medication. He looked at me carefully. "She's been on treatment for hypertension for about 14 months, Mr. Mwangi. You were not aware. 14 months. For 14 months, my wife had been on medication for a serious condition, and I had not known. She didn't tell me," I said. My voice came out very small. "She may not have wanted to worry you." The doctor said gently, "It's not uncommon, but sir, the stress factor is important." When we spoke to her briefly before she lost consciousness, she mentioned something about a phone call she had received earlier today. That upset her greatly. She was quite distressed. A phone call? What kind of phone call? She didn't give details, just that it was from a family member and it upset her. I looked back at Daniel and Priscilla through the glass wall of the consultation room. They were still sitting there. Daniel was texting now. Priscilla had finished her coffee. Something inside me went very, very still. "Can I see her?" "Shortly. She's stabilized, but she's not conscious. We're monitoring her closely. The next 24 hours are important." I nodded. I shook his hand. I walked out of that room, and I stood in the middle of the corridor, and I made a decision. A quiet, calm, absolute decision. I am not a man who shouts. I am not a man who makes scenes. I never have been. Margaret used to say that was my greatest strength, and sometimes my greatest weakness, that I hold things inside until they either dissolve or solidify into something permanent. What I felt in that corridor solidified. I went back to the waiting area. I sat down. Daniel looked at me and started to say something, but I held up one hand and shook my head. He stopped. Then I took out my phone. I opened the banking app, the one linked to our joint savings account, the one Daniel had access to. I went to the settings. I navigated to the section labeled Authorized Users. I removed Daniel's access. Then I opened the secondary account, the household and emergency fund. I removed his access from that one too. Then I called the bank's customer service line, and, speaking very quietly into the phone, I explained that I needed to change the primary contact information on all 3 accounts registered to my name, including the supplementary credit card that Priscilla sometimes used when she and Daniel were short and came to us for help. I canceled that card. I requested new account numbers for security purposes. The whole process took about 11 minutes. I put my phone back in my pocket. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the ICU door. Hold on, Margaret, I thought. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. For the next hour, nothing happened. And then Priscilla's phone rang. She looked at her phone screen, frowned, answered it. Yes, this is. Wait, what? What do you mean declined? I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the ICU door. Daniel. Her voice went tight. Daniel. I heard Daniel shift in his chair. What? My card was declined. I just got a notification. The supplementary card, it says it's been cancelled. A pause. What? That can't be. I heard Daniel's phone come out. Buttons tapping. Then silence. Then, Dad. I turned to look at him slowly. Dad, I'm getting an error on the account app. It's saying my access has been removed. I said. Did you change something? I looked at him for a long, steady moment. My son, my Daniel, 34 years old, sitting in a hospital where his mother was fighting for her life, asking me about bank account access. We can talk about it later, I said. Your mother is the priority right now. He stared at me. Something moved across his face. Confusion, and underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. Priscilla leaned over and whispered something in his ear. His jaw tightened. He looked at me again. Dad, I have bills set to come out of that account next week. Important payments. We can talk about it later, I repeated. Dad, Daniel. My voice didn't rise. It never rises. But there was something in it that made him stop. Your mother is in the ICU. She is unconscious. She may have been upset today by a phone call from a family member. I would like to sit here quietly and wait for news about whether my wife of 40 years is going to be all right. Can we please do that? The words phone call from a family member landed like stones in still water. I saw it on his face, the ripple, the recognition. Priscilla looked away. Yes, I thought, yes, I know. A few hours later, Margaret's sister arrived. Auntie Rose, a big, loud, warm woman who I have always loved dearly. She came rushing in with her coat half on, eyes red, grabbing my hands the moment she saw me. Gerald, oh Gerald, how is she? What are the doctors saying? I gave her what I knew. She held my hands the whole time. When I finished, she looked at me, and then she looked at Daniel, and the warmth in her face changed into something harder. Daniel, she said. Auntie Rose. He stood. Were you there when she collapsed? No, we came after. Were you the one who called her this morning? A silence so thick you could have cut it with something. Auntie Rose. Were you the one who called her this morning, Daniel? Answer me. It was a conversation about finances, about the house, my house, the house Margaret and I had built. The house Daniel had, apparently, been having conversations about. What about the house? My voice was very quiet. Daniel looked at Priscilla. She looked at her feet. Dad, Priscilla and I have been looking at some investment options, and the property is valuable. We thought if you and Mama moved somewhere smaller, a retirement place, something easier to manage, we could sell the property, and I don't have words for what I felt. I have tried many times since that evening to describe the feeling of hearing your son suggest that the home you built, the physical evidence of 40 years of sacrifice, should be sold to fund his investment portfolio while your wife lies unconscious 20 feet away. I don't have the words, so I said nothing. I stood up, slowly, and I walked to the window at the end of the corridor, and I looked out at the city lights coming on as evening fell, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth. And I did not cry, because I decided a long time ago that I would not let cruelty make me collapse. Auntie Rose was not so restrained. You called your mother to tell her you want to sell her home. Her voice filled the corridor. This morning, today, and now she is lying in there, Auntie Rose. We didn't know she was going to. You didn't know a 70-year old woman with high blood pressure. Yes, I knew about her condition, Daniel, because your mother called me when she was too afraid to tell your father. You didn't know that telling her she could lose her home might be dangerous. You didn't think. The other people in the waiting area had gone very still. A nurse looked through the window from the nurse's station. She wasn't going to lose the home, Priscilla said. Her voice was careful, controlled, like she was explaining something to someone a little slow. We were presenting an option, a financial, "Don't you speak to me," Auntie Rose said. "Don't you open your mouth in my direction." Priscilla pressed her lips together, looked at Daniel. Daniel stared at the floor. I stood at the window. My hand rested on the glass. Outside, the city went on. Cars, lights, people going home to their families. I thought about the 14 months Margaret had hidden her diagnosis. I thought about why she hid it. I thought about a woman who knew her son was putting pressure on her husband, who didn't want to add to my burden, who carried sickness and worry and fear all by herself because she was trying to protect me. She was always protecting me. My throat tightened. Please, I thought again. Please, Margaret. Stay. Margaret regained consciousness around 2 in the morning. The nurse came and got me first, the primary next of kin, she said, and I walked into that ICU room, and I saw my wife lying there with tubes and monitors, and the pale wash of hospital light on her face, and I sat down in the chair beside her bed, and I took her hand in both of mine. Her eyes were open, barely, but she looked at me. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was rough and thin. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here. You drove all that way." Of course I drove all that way. I pressed her hand to my lips. Where else would I be? She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Daniel called me this morning." "I know. He wants the house, Gerald." "I know." I told him that house is ours, yours and mine. We built that house." Her voice broke. "He said we were being selfish, sitting on an asset, that we were old and didn't need all that space." She closed her eyes. "He sounded just like a stranger, Gerald. My son sounded like a stranger." I held her hand and said nothing. What could I say? She was right. "You locked the accounts," she said. I looked at her. "You know. Rose told me." She said Daniel was asking about it in the corridor. A very small, tired smile crossed her lips. Good. That smile, even there, even then, with wires in her arm and a blood pressure monitor beeping beside her. That small smile. "Rest," I told her. "Everything else can wait." "Gerald." "Yes." "Don't be too hard on him." A pause. "But don't be too soft either." I almost laughed. "After everything, after all of it, I'll do my best," I said. By morning, the doctors said Margaret was stable and improving. Her blood pressure had come down. She would need rest, monitoring, and a serious reevaluation of her stress levels and lifestyle going forward. When I came back out to the waiting area, Daniel and Priscilla were still there. They had stayed the whole night. I will give them that. Daniel looked terrible. His eyes were red, and he hadn't shaved, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. Priscilla sat beside him looking like something had gone out of her. Daniel stood when he saw me. "How is she?" "Stable, improving." He let out a long breath. "Dad, come here," I said. I looked at Priscilla. "Both of you." I led them to a quiet corner of the waiting area. I sat down. They sat across from me. And I looked at my son, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you're deciding to be completely honest. "Daniel," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer." He nodded. "Do you know why I locked those accounts?" He glanced at Priscilla. "Because you were angry about." "No." I cut him off softly. "Try again." He was quiet. "I locked those accounts," I said, "because I sat in that corridor last night and I looked at the two of you sitting there calm, scrolling your phones while your mother was in the ICU, and I realized something. I realized that for the past 2 years I have been confusing love with access. I gave you access to my accounts because I thought that was love. I gave you our savings because I thought that was love. I let things pass, comments, disrespect, missed calls, missed visits, because I told myself that loving you meant absorbing all of that without complaint." I paused. "But last night your mother told me you called her this morning to discuss selling the house, and she ended up on the floor, and a neighbor called an ambulance, and a doctor called me, and the two Of you were here for 2 hours without calling me. The words settled like dust. I locked those accounts. I said quietly, because I needed you to feel, for just a moment, what it feels like to have something important suddenly removed, without warning, without being asked, without being considered. Daniel's jaw moved. His eyes went shiny. Dad, I'm not finished. I kept my voice level. The 30,000 I gave you, the access I gave you, the house I built, those things are not investments. They're not assets. They're not figures on a spreadsheet. I leaned forward slightly. That house is where your mother taught you to walk. That money came from her sewing clothes at midnight, so you could have school shoes that fit. Those accounts hold the savings of a man who worked 31 years in a factory so you could have a better life than he did. My voice didn't break. I had decided it wouldn't. I am not angry at you, Daniel. I am heartbroken, because somewhere along the way, my son started looking at his parents and seeing liabilities instead of people. The silence was long and complete. Priscilla was looking at her hands. Her face had changed entirely. The careful, polished, controlled expression was gone. She looked young, she looked ashamed. Daniel's first tear fell without any drama, just slipped down his cheek while he stared at the floor. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't expect what came next." Priscilla raised her head. Her eyes were wet, and she looked at me directly for the first time since any of this began. "Mr. Mwangi," she said, "I need to say something. I waited. The house idea, the accounts, that was mostly me." She swallowed. "Daniel went along with it because he loves me, and I convinced him it was the sensible thing to do. I made it sound like a business decision. I made it sound logical, and she stopped. Started again. "I have always been a little uncomfortable with how much your parents sacrificed, because it made me feel like we owed something, and instead of sitting with that feeling, I tried to control it. I tried to make everything a transaction, a calculation." She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. "My parents didn't sacrifice for me the way yours sacrificed for Daniel. I grew up in a home where money was practical, not emotional, and I thought that was smart. I thought I was being smart." Her voice went very quiet. "But last night, sitting in that corridor, thinking about your wife on the other side of that door, I kept thinking about what she would have looked like sewing those clothes at midnight, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still can't. I looked at this young woman, this complicated, armored, frightened young woman, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Compassion, not forgiveness, not yet. That takes time, and it has to be earned. But compassion, the recognition that people who have never been shown something often don't know how to give it, that I could offer. I appreciate you saying that. I told her, and I meant it. Margaret came home 11 days later. The house felt different when we walked in. Or maybe I was different. Maybe it's the same thing. Mrs. Achieng brought food, more food than 2 old people could eat in a week. She hugged Margaret on the doorstep and cried openly in the way that neighbors who have known you for decades are allowed to cry. Daniel and Priscilla helped carry Margaret's things inside. They had visited every day in the hospital. Not always for long, but they came. And something about the way Daniel sat beside his mother's bed, the way he held her hand without being asked, the way he didn't look at his phone even once, told me something was shifting in him. It would take time, I knew that. 34 years of a certain way of being doesn't change in 11 days. But it was beginning. A week after Margaret came home, Daniel came to me alone. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and he put an envelope down in front of me. "What's this?" I asked. 15,000. He said, "It's not all of it, but it's a start. I'm going to pay back everything, Dad, every cent." I looked at the envelope. I looked at my son. "I don't care about the money, Daniel," I said. "I need you to understand that. Keep it for your firm. Pay your bills." He shook his head. "No, Dad, I don't want it anymore, not like this." He looked up at me. "You spent 31 years in a factory, and Mama sewed at midnight, and you never once asked me to be grateful. You just gave, and I took it, and I calculated it, and I turned it into a number." His voice went rough. "I don't want to be that person." I reached across the table, and I put my hand on his arm. "Then don't be," I said simply. He nodded. He couldn't speak for a moment. Then, Can I come for dinner this Sunday? Me and Priscilla. Come for dinner," I said. "Mama's cooking." I almost laughed again. "If the doctor allows it. She'll try whether he allows it or not." He laughed too. A small, wet, genuine laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from him in a long, long time. It sounded a little like the boy I used to read to sleep. They say age brings wisdom. I'm not sure that's always true. Sometimes age just brings silence, and people mistake silence for wisdom. But I have had time in these past weeks to think, sitting on the small veranda of our house, listening to the neighborhood sounds, watching Margaret move slowly around the garden she loves, and I have come to understand a few things. I understand now that giving without boundaries can teach people the wrong lessons. When you give endlessly and silently, and never say this is too much, this is not right, you are not teaching love. You are teaching that you have no limits. And people, even people who love you, will eventually step past a limit that doesn't exist. I understand now that my wife's silence about her illness was not a kindness to me. It was a burden she should never have carried alone. And the reason she carried it alone was because she was afraid of adding to my worry, afraid of the fragility of things. Margaret and I will talk more from now on. We have promised each other this. I understand now that my son had drifted. Not because he was born without goodness. He was not. He had drifted because goodness requires tending, the same way a garden does, and he had spent years in an environment that valued strategy over sentiment, acquisition over appreciation. He had simply forgotten, and forgetting is not the same as being lost. There is a difference, small but important. And I understand, perhaps most of all, that a locked account is a very small thing. It is not revenge. It is not punishment. It is a door, quietly closed, that says, "This is not how we treat each other." And sometimes a door like that, closed firmly and without drama, does more to wake someone up than any amount of shouting ever could. If you are watching this and you have parents who are still living, go to them. Not to inherit from them, not to borrow from them, not to manage them or plan around them or calculate what they have and what you might one day receive. Go to them because they are running out of time, and so are you, and neither of you knows when the clock runs out. Call your mother, not to give her news, not to ask for something, just to hear her voice, just to let her hear yours. Because I am telling you from the position of a 63-year-old man who almost lost the woman who has been his reason for everything. You do not know how much you would give to hear that voice one more time until it falls silent. Tell your father you are proud of him, not of what he provided. Of him, his hands, his years, his quiet mornings and long nights, and all the things he gave up that he never mentioned, because men like him, men like me, do not mention those things. We just carry them, and we will carry them until we can't. And if you are a parent watching this, know that silence is not the same as strength. Speak up, draw lines, say this hurt me, say this is not acceptable, not with anger, with honesty, because your children cannot learn to respect what you never showed them was worth respecting. The house still stands. Margaret's garden is blooming, a little more slowly than before, but blooming. Daniel and Priscilla come on Sundays. Priscilla learned finally, properly, to make Margaret's recipe for pilau. She got it wrong the first 3 times and right on the 4th. Margaret laughed each time, including the times it was wrong. Including especially those times. I sit on the veranda and watch them, my family, imperfect and complicated, and learning, all of us slowly, how to be better to one another. And I think this is what the factory was for. This is what the midnight sewing was for, not the house, not the savings, not the accounts. This